Welcome to Washington Policy on the Go. My name is David Bose. I'm the Communications and Marketing Director for Washington Policy Center. And this is the every other week program where we bring on center directors to bring you up to date on the latest in state policy and policy analysis. Sometimes we take a look at what the media is saying to see if they're missing some perspective that we need to add, as is the case today. We'll be covering a variety of issues, including one on a potential state rule that could increase the cost of housing, supposedly in the name of saving the environment. But as you'll soon hear from Todd Myers, our Center for the Environment Director, the reality is it will increase costs without actually accomplishing anything for the environment if they proceed with creating that rule. So we'll talk about that and share what that is coming up. Then we'll talk with our Center for Education Director Liv Finne. We'll talk with her about some of the hits that charter schools have been taking in the media of late, why that might be, and what the reality of charter schools is and what their record was, particularly during all this learning loss during the COVID era. We'll talk with her about that and also review her analysis of how some COVID relief funding has been used in the education establishment to implement critical race theory components. So we'll talk with her about that coming up, and she'll be able to take questions. Just a quick reminder, if you have questions, you can insert them anytime in the little Zoom box there, the toolbox that says Q&A. That's the best place. There is a chat function, but it's a little harder to grab the questions from there because that can be a moving tool, and so that your questions can be buried. So it's better if you can just insert them in the Q&A box. And we do try and get to all the questions. I want to start with our Center for Education Director, Todd Myers. Todd, thanks so much for making the time today. I know you have a very busy schedule, but there's a state rule being proposed that would make all housing electric. In other words, no more natural gas heat, which was a surprise to me because I myself in my home installed natural gas heat specifically to save money and energy, and now hearing that this is supposed to be a bad thing surprised me. Tell us about how this proposed rule came about and what's wrong with it.
So Washington last year adopted a system to cap CO2 emissions and have it gradually decline to 5% of 1990 levels by 2050. This, from the State Building Code Council, is an effort to promote that and they've already made commercial, they're trying to make residential construction all electric. So to eliminate natural gas to meet those CO2 reductions. The problem is, there's several problems. One of the problems is that it doesn't increase CO2 reductions. In other words, it just simply implements the existing cap. It doesn't add to total CO2 reductions. What was interesting is that in the proposals, the members of the State Building Code Council were told that this would reduce CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions are going to be reduced one way or the other. What the State Building Code Council simply wants to say is, you're going to be forced to do it the way we want you to do it, even if there are better ways to do it. And in fact, there are probably better ways to do it. So what was interesting is in the original proposal to ban natural gas water heating and then ban natural gas home heating, is that it said that this would have no impact on housing affordability because it would actually be cheaper to build to these standards than using natural gas. Now, this is the old argument that there's just lots and lots of piles of money laying around and only government sees them and the builders don't see them. And if we have to force them to pick up that free money to build more efficient. Obviously, that's not true, but their analysis showed that, and their analysis showed that it over time on utilities. Well, there were a bunch of changes at the last minute, and they released a new estimate last week, right before they discussed this, literally 2 days before, and it found that, okay, actually this does increase building costs. Now, what's interesting is that they have to, if it increased building costs, they have to explain that impact, but they never changed the section that it said it has no impact. They just changed the analysis, but not the sort of the headline. So now they've admitted that it actually does increase building costs. But they said, don't worry, it actually reduces utility costs. And so you'll get that money back over time. The data that they were using to prove that is from the Office of Financial Management, and it was from 2019. But if you use the 2021 numbers from their own estimates, that flips. And actually doing this would increase utility costs. So we have gone in the course of a week from a proposal that would be cheaper to build and save money on utilities to a proposal that will be more expensive to build and will increase the cost of utilities, all while doing nothing, adding nothing, I should say, to total CO2 reductions.
Now, why does it do nothing to reduce CO2 reductions? What was missing from the original proposal that shows that there is no environmental benefit to this?
So Washington State has targets for CO2 reductions, and it cannot emit more than that. So if we run out of permits for gasoline or natural gas or other things like that, there's simply no more permits. Well, there's sort of an emergency clause, but in the long run, you have to meet those targets one way or the other. So how you implement that is up for debate. But whether you meet those targets is not. Now, I will say, I think those targets are wrong. I think that they are unscientific. I think they're based on a lot of misapprehensions, but that's as maybe.
By any chance, are they divisible by 10?
Shockingly, they have to be cut in half by 2030. So 50% by 2030. It's amazing, I know, that science out exactly divisible by 10. So that is right. That's an indication that they are bogus. But if the State Building Code Council did literally nothing, we would still have to meet those same exact targets. We would just do it in a different way. So that's the problem is that the State Building Code Council wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want to claim that they're reducing CO2 emissions, which they are not. And all the same time, want to say, oh, but you'll save energy or you'll save, costs, which you won't. So unfortunately, we made those arguments last Friday, and they went ahead and adopted the requirement for no natural gas water heating. And then the meeting earlier today where I testified, they were considering applying that also to heating as well. So we will see what they decide.
It's fascinating to me how they do this kind of thing, knowing that it's going to increase the costs, and in the face of the evidence that you just described that negates all of the previous reasons for the rule. And as you point out, if you make these predictions that you're going to have these cost savings and you're wrong within 18 months or so, I mean, less than 2 years, maybe you should have a more humble approach to creating mandates on how people should do things. I mean, as you point out, if you're a builder and you want to save money and you figured out a way to do it with natural gas, you'll do that. If you figure out the electricity is the way to go, you'll do that. And with the changing electricity landscape, it seems like this is a mandate to put extra pressure on a grid that the governor and others are already wanting to put extra pressure on, with banning gas engines and cars and that aren't electric, and then tearing down the Snake River dams. I mean, there's a cascading effect on the electricity supply, I think.
Well, and in fact, last Friday I brought that very thing up, which is that the Pacific Northwest National Labs released a study in 2020 rather, looking at what would happen if Washington State had 1 million electric vehicles, which is the goal by 2030. Now, I think that they will adjust that, but that's the goal at this point. And what they found is that, of course, it would increase total demand for electricity. But most of all, it would increase demand during peak hours when electricity is most expensive. And during the summertime, they estimate that it would double the costs of electricity during those peak hours. That does not take into consideration electrifying all houses at the same time. So I raised this issue, and the response from one of the members of the Building Code Council was, well, that's not our issue. Right? We're looking at this. That's not our issue. And so everybody is myopically looking only at their own little problem and not considering or caring about the cumulative impact of all of these sorts of things. California has had this approach and they are looking at brownouts this summer. They openly admit that they're probably going to have brownouts this summer. So it's a really dangerous and I think reckless approach. And what I think indicates, the game that they're playing is that they use the life cycle analysis using the tool from Office of Financial Management to show that costs will be lower and that there'll be savings. But when that same tool then turns around and says, no, actually costs will be higher and there won't be savings, they go, oh, we're going to do it anyway. Right? So the commitment is not to use the data that's available, and the data they do use, they only use it as long as it tells the story they want.
Right.
And of course, any projection, these projections are 50 years, over 50 years. Any projection longer than 5 years is bogus. 15 years ago, between the last 15 years, we've had the Great Recession and a pandemic amongst, and the creation of the iPhone. So lots changes that happens in 15 years. And so pretending that you can accurately predict 50 years out and then make a rational decision on that is foolish, which is why the dynamism and flexibility of the market is so much better than sort of these locked in concrete government decisions that pretend that we can see the future.
Is there any possibility that, somehow the State Building Code Council would see the light and come to a more flexible position?
So this meeting is actually, I should be clear, this meeting is a subcommittee, the energy subcommittee of the State Building Code Council. So the energy subcommittee is likely to adopt, they did adopt one, they're likely to adopt the other today, and then it will go to the full State Building Code Council. But the State Building Code Council members are appointed by Governor Inslee. So you tell me what the likelihood is that we'll turn down something that the governor has wanted when they are his hand-picked members.
So the governor himself has spoken up, and he wants this rule for us to rely on all electric houses, while at the same time combing reasons to remove hydroelectric dams.
That's exactly right. And his study on all the ways that tearing down the dams would be a good idea will come out on this Thursday.
And we should point out he's had other studies that didn't come to the conclusion that he wanted. So maybe this study will finally do the trick for him. Who knows?
Well, in fact, the last study that he did was, should we tear down the dams? And it was inconclusive. So this study is, okay, let's just assume that we tear down the dams. How can we deal with this? So if you don't get the answer you want, just the next study around, just assume that you get the answer you want and see what happens.
Yeah, let's skip studying that first question and just go to how good would the aftermath of this be, and then define the terms that way. Todd, I have to tell you before I let you go, I saw a sad post.
I just want to add one thing.
Go ahead.
No, I haven't verified the rumor that the name of the study is Tearing Down the Dams, Awesome or Super Awesome. So we'll have to wait till Thursday to see if that's the case.
I saw a post from meteorologist Cliff Mast today lamenting some use of data and pictures in the Seattle Times, where they showed the story was basically snowpack is at a dangerous level. We've got dangerous droughts. And they show this very brown, barren landscape of Eastern Washington. And Mass shares a picture that was taken last week of a similar area that's lush and green, and points out that the moisture level is higher than is about normal everywhere, and the reservoirs are higher than normal just about everywhere in Eastern Washington because of the moist and cool and rainy spring. And yet he sounds a little like Linus, or I forget the Pigpen character or something in the Peanuts character that was just followed by a cloud, of sorrow because he can't figure out why the data keeps getting ignored by this major media outlet, and it's frustrating him. So I just thought I'd share that with you because you're not the only one now who's being tortured by the continued assertion that there's this massive snowpack elimination, despite all the data and the state's data and government's data showing that is not the case. So
yeah, well, the reason I decided to take this call outside today is because it is literally the first day over 70 degrees that we have had all year, and we're into June, which gives you an indication of how cold and rainy and everything else that it has been. what is interesting is that I emailed the reporter who wrote that story. It was initially in the Spokesman Review and then picked up by the Seattle Times. And I pointed out to him that there was a claim in there by the EPA that said that snowpack has been declining no matter what starting point you choose. Now, the EPA always chooses the 1950s to show snowpack decline because the 1950s had very high snowpack. So basically, any line you draw starting then has declining snowpack. But this is the first time I've seen them say it doesn't matter when you start the trend, snowpack is declining. So I pointed out to him, I was like, well, that's not true. You go to the state climatologist's webpage, not my numbers, not the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who also keeps numbers, but the state climatologist. And if you start in the 1970s or 1980, it's actually upward, which is, a 40, 45-year trend. So the EPA, at the same time, they say, if snowpack is declining no matter what year you choose to start with, their own data and the data of the state climatologists show that's not true. So then they say, well, but it's better to have a longer trend. Okay, that's fine. You can argue about why 1955 or the 1950s are the best starting point, but you cannot then say that any starting point proves your point, as if only the starting point that you've chosen makes your point. And I think those are the really frustrating games. And the EPA knows that reporters don't like to question them. They don't like to say, well, I don't think that's true. The EPA says, we're the EPA, we know best, and this is the truth. And unfortunately, there's a lot of reporters who will simply repeat that.
So they just get to keep using the outlier of the 1950s and then say, look at this disaster, and then make that further claim saying anywhere along the line, it shows that we're headed for climate disaster and snowpack disaster. And when they're proven wrong, they say, yeah, but still. And that's it. It's the yeah, but still scientific conclusion, possibly divisible by 10.
It's called Mott and Bailey. And what a Mott and Bailey argument is that they say, we are true under any circumstances. And then you say, well, no, that's not true. Under these circumstances, you're not right. It's like, well, but okay, if we retreat to this argument, then we're still correct, right? So you make a broad sweeping claim, and then when it's proven wrong, you still say, well, but if I retreat to this more narrow argument, then I'm still right. It's common. What happens is that they do it because they can get away with it, and they are rarely called on it. That's the frustrating thing, and it's why our discussion about climate is bad. Even though I readily admit that we should do things to reduce the risk of climate change, having a discussion with actual data and actual numbers is really difficult.
Let me go through some rapid fire questions for you since they came in and you can't stay to the end for questions. This is from Mark. Are there any other states adopting similar restrictions to the source of fuel for heating of either of water or homes?
I don't know if there are others that have adopted the specific type of regulations that we are looking at. I would not be surprised if California did. California went even further and mandated rooftop solar, which is super expensive and super inefficient, which I think would be an even dumber policy than the one we've adopted. So it wouldn't be surprising to me if they had done it, but I don't know specifically.
This is from Joanna. This discussion is so helpful. Thank you, Todd. Would it be beneficial to increase our water storage capacity, either the size or quantity of reservoirs? Could this help with generating electricity through dams as well as water usage for residents?
Absolutely. We definitely need to do that. Washington State, there are still parts of Washington State, despite our very cold and rainy winter, even in Eastern Washington, that are in drought, where the soil moisture is low. And so we're going to need to deal with that, and that's not going to get better. What's interesting, though, is that even if snowpack declines in the future, precipitation may increase. So we're going to, rather than storing that precipitation as snow, we're going to need to find a way to store it as water. And that's, increase reservoirs, things like that.
Next question. Didn't the governor recently settle a lawsuit about stacking the state building code council membership?
He did, actually. So the Building Industry Association of Washington, BIAW, has a seat on that council. Governor ignored their appointment It's basically supposed to be a formality. They're supposed to choose, and he's supposed to appoint them. The governor choosing the BIAW person chose his own sort of left-wing environmental person. BIAW sued and won. And not only did they get their person, but the glorious taxpayers of Washington graciously paid BIAW $70,000 for the governor's arrogance.
And last question, will home and building owners be required to replace their existing gas, space, and water heating with electric heat pumps? And who will pay for the increased transformer, electrical panel, wiring, ductwork sizes, etc.?
So that's a good question. No, the retrofits are not required. This is for new construction. And the cost of all the additional panels, wiring for solar, other things like that they're looking to do. So I don't know that the wiring for solar is included in this, but there is increased electrical demand. All of those costs are added to the cost of construction, which by the revised analysis found that this would be more expensive to build a house this way than under the current rules, which allow natural gas.
Well, thanks, Todd. I know that you've got a very busy day ahead of you, and so I appreciate you making the time.
Okay, thanks. It was good to talk with you, and thank you for letting me do it from a nice sunny day.
Yeah, it looks pretty beautiful out there. Let's bring forward Liv Finne. She is the director for the WPC's Center for Education. Liv, thank you also for making the time. You and I are obviously not outside. We have the WPC backgrounds just to save everyone from looking at whatever's behind us here. So why don't we start with, there's been a couple of different reports recently about charter schools. One was basically, shock. Charter schools are hiring teachers, people to teach that aren't credentialed. And this was supposed to be a shocking revelation about charter schools. What makes that story basically at its core pretty foolish? What is it about charter schools and how they hire teachers that makes that story a non-starter?
Well, this is a story that was pushed by KUOW and the Seattle Times back in April, examining the Summit Charter School Network, which is a high school network of 3 schools in Seattle, West Seattle, and Tacoma, about 1,000 students altogether. These schools are getting 98 to 99% graduating. They're graduating their students from high school and going on to college. They're high performing, highly innovative, really excellent school network. And the law of charter schools says that they are supposed to hire certified teachers. However, the law also provides that in cases of unusual competence, the charter schools can hire an individual that is not certified. And so, is it completely evidently you have to report once a year to the Charter School Commission those teachers that are fully certificated and those that are not. At the time of the story that was run by KUOW and the Seattle Times, all the teachers at Summit Charter High Schools were fully certified. And now claims are being made even by those like people like Senator Wellman, who's the chair of the Senate Education Committee, that a fine that this lack of certification entitles the state to collect the funding provided by the taxpayers to this network of schools in the tune of $3.8 million, which is completely made out of clearly a politically motivated attack on this network of schools, because there is no law that ties the funding of these schools to the certification of their teachers. So that's the first attack on charter schools that happened back in April, and I wrote about that on the blog.
Yeah.
Then there's been a subsequent attack. So
before we get to that one, I want to take a step back here and just take a look at something, because there's this threat of a fine because there was a lack of certification. It reminds me of a series I bring up fairly frequently, Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, where it's a British satire about how politics works and how the civil service works. And there's a city that doesn't turn in their paperwork, and the civil service is horrified. Politicians are being urged to punish them for not turning in their paperwork. And it turns out that the city that doesn't do the government forms is also achieving the best results when it comes to social services, education, and other things. So, when it comes down to this charter school, there's this desire, hey, we should find this charter school because we don't like the way that they were hiring teachers, even though, yeah, sure, technically it's okay, but we're mad about this. How do these charter schools compare for learning for the kids versus the general public schools of Seattle, for example?
Well, they are outperforming the traditional schools serving the similar types of children. Okay. There's no question that they're getting better results. The data show this. And that is what makes me so angry when I read these articles, because that fact is never put in the Seattle Times or KUW reporting. And the other fact that they don't report is that these schools are underfunded. Okay. So they're targeted for attack, even though they don't get the same funding that other traditional schools get. So they don't get the local levy funding that taxpayers provide, that the people that are sending their kids are paying, and they're denied about $3,000 per student in equal funding. They don't get capital funding. They don't get access to public school facilities. And so they have been handicapped with this lower funding. And yet the newspapers are cherry picking techniques, to attack them. And it really, the whole purpose of charter schools is to create a system of schools that is free from this overburdensome regulation, that allows them to innovate and meet the needs of their students by using methods that actually work, instead of known methods being used by the traditional schools that everyone knows are failing, like they're failing to teach phonics and reading. Okay, so now these charter schools are actually putting in place better methods. And what happens, that our media, major media sources are not reporting how well they're doing, and they're not reporting that the state is underfunding these schools. And so, of course, I have to object, because it is so fundamentally unfair. And you'll hear them use and tout, you'll recall that part of the reason why we even passed the charter school law was to get at this stubborn, persistent achievement gap between low-income students, Black and Hispanic students, and white and Asian students. And that was the purported reason for opening charter schools, so that they would have, so we could get at this and improve by raising improving the quality of schools offered to inner city kids in Tacoma and Seattle. That was what the whole purpose of charter schools was. And now we have networks of schools that are actually doing this. They're actually narrowing the achievement gap. They're actually graduating 98% of their students, which doesn't happen in the traditional schools. They're actually delivering better results. When we talk about impact schools, that system of elementary schools is the highest performing charter school network. It is better school than the neighboring schools in Tukwila and Highline. The numbers show this, and yet we have an attack on them. So now I'm kind of moving ahead to that.
Yeah, we can go forward with the next attack, but first I wanted to ask the motivation. As soon as I heard about this oh my gosh, there's a non-certified person teaching, and knowing that private schools do this all the time. They get somebody who's either well-read, maybe they majored in literature and they're teaching English in class, but they didn't major in education, but the students are doing just fine. There's this obsession with the state monopoly process, and that's usually the state education union, the Washington Education Association, that's upset about that. So as soon as I heard about it, I thought, well, obviously the WEA is upset still about charter schools, and this is part of that continued campaign to delegitimize, especially in years where the achievement gaps and learning loss of students because of COVID shutdowns that the union, that the Washington Education Association encouraged to prolong beyond, the other states, all of our surrounding states. This masks their problem, right?
It's a great point. You'll notice in the traditional media that a lot of teachers are leaving. They're having trouble fulfilling positions for teachers, so they're hiring individuals on emergency credentials that are not fully qualified to teach in the traditional schools. Okay, and everyone knows, and I have this Harvard study that I've used for years. That this Professor Thomas Kane he's got a great piece and great study showing there's no correlation between certifying a teacher and getting a great teacher, getting great results. There's just no correlation. Everyone knows that the best teachers have a passion for their subject. They're not, that let's say know marine biology really well, or literature very well, or excited about their subject. And what we have a system now is a system of hoops that prospective teachers have to jump through, that are willing and have the money to pay to acquire these expensive teaching credentials, even though they don't have any content knowledge that they're really excited about. So we have written along, for many years have suggested that we change the way we license our teachers to open up the possibility that people with content knowledge and a passion for the subject are allowed to teach, but they're not allowed to teach unless they have paid for an expensive credential at the University of Washington's education school or some other education school. So that's all part of the control that the union has over who teaches. You're totally right to think that. This is what this is coming from the union. The union is very afraid, and it's very interesting because I think this could be related to the fact that everybody is aware that that the schools now have shown the school test scores from last fall are terrible. 70% of our students in Washington State failed the state math test, 52% failed the state English test, and the charter schools have done better now. And so I think that, we have failed to, the legislature has failed to authorize the expansion of charter schools, so that we can't open new charter schools. We only have 18, and the people wanted to have 40 charter schools. We only have 18 in the state. And I think the union is trying to just foreclose any growth and kill the ones that are there. That would serve their interests. It certainly wouldn't serve the interests of the children that are going.
That's interesting. They've established where there's this, this pressure that suddenly appeared to punish charter schools for hiring somebody without credentials, while at the same time, the state monopoly system is seeking people that are so desperate they're willing to hire without credentials, with no threats of fines or anything else. Right. And the results are in the tank. And there's no surprise there. I mean, there's been challenges with learning loss when you leave kids out of school and you reduce the number of days that they're educated, when you reduce the time in the classroom, when you have increasing numbers of half days and off days and stuff where teachers can't get traction. But with COVID, all that was on steroids, where kids were out of school generally for 2 years.
It's terrible, Dave. It's so terrible, and the media is not covering this. And there are many good studies coming out of research universities showing how desperately bad our situation is right now for the kids that have lost up about 2 years of their learning, have been seriously interrupted. We have a new study coming out this summer that describes the many different losses, in academic learning losses, mental and health losses that the kids have suffered because of the policies of keeping our schools closed longer than they should have been. Washington State was one of the last to reopen. I mean, the countries of Western Europe opened that spring of 2020. You realize that. Now, Sweden opened their schools in the spring of 2020. We kept ours closed through 2020, the fall of 2020, and the spring of 2021. And with Sweden, Norway, Belgium, France, Germany, they all found ways to open their schools, and not here in our country. And it is going to cost the children who suffered this tremendous, I think it's $2 trillion in lost earnings. They're not going to have the opportunities that they should have. They're going to be moved through, socially promoted. This is another thing that irritated me about the recent attack on Impact. Impact schools, this charter school network of elementary schools, is not socially promoting children that are not ready to move to the next level. Okay, that is the corruption that's happening in our public school systems. Kids that do not learn what they should in second grade are moved to the third grade. By the time they get to fifth grade, they're so far behind they can't possibly, pass the tests, and by high school they drop out. That is what we have in our traditional public school system. The charter schools do not subscribe to that model. They want to. They do not socially promote kids that are not ready to move to the next grade, and they focus on the child that is behind and catch them up. That is why they're able to graduate and go on to college. So to have a reporter come in and attack a school, a charter school network like Impact, which is not socially promoting children, is an effort to keep in place a failing policy, the failing policy of social promotion in traditional schools.
So what was the secondary attack on charter schools? As you describe it, what's the? I even hate to use the word attack because I view it more as a distraction. Like, it's clear we know from the poll that we did the end of last year, support for choice, educational choice for parents is through the roof, and people are saying, hey, we had a system, and the system was dedicated to itself, to the system, not to finding ways, innovative ways, to provide for kids with varied needs that are out of school. And so, there's this opportunity that's never existed before. And it looks to me like, pointing to places where there is this limited choice in Washington, it's, hey, I want to distract you over here, over here, over here, rather than deal with our own problems. So what was the other distraction about charter schools that you saw that bothered you?
Well, the first, Ann Dornfeld at KUOW has launched on a series of hit pieces against the Impact Charter School Network. There are 3 operating elementary schools in South King County, and the Impact Puget Sound Elementary, and 2 other Impact elementary schools. And then there's a new one that's been approved to open in Renton in the fall of 2023. The current number of students at Impact is 1,200 students. Between the 3 elementary schools, a lot of families have moved their kids into the Impact public school system. The Ann Dornfeld, the first Ann Dornfeld piece, had to do with special needs, a wild claim. She took, 1 or 2 families who were unhappy, a special needs family, and then they were complaining. They did not like what they were getting at this school. They were there by choice. Remember, they chose to go there, and they were not happy. Then they went to the media, and then the media and Dornfeld took their singular experiences and generalized and attacked the schools for not providing students with special needs the education they're entitled to receive by law. And the response of Impact was that that's a flat out lie. We are doing that and more. And I just find that whole strategy outrageous to begin with, because the special needs, anyway.
I'm just curious. I've heard from a lot of parents over the years, in general public schools, frustration because their kids were special needs and they weren't getting the services that they wanted in, the traditional monopoly system. So I just find it interesting that this other school where you can leave and go to the general public school whenever you want, that's newsworthy. But what about all these other? I mean, I feel like you could put all the school names in a hat, pick one out, and you'll find parents that are upset by a lack of accountability for their students' particular needs. Well, because it's a one size fits all system, for the most part, right? So that whole special needs is like a low hanging fruit. If you're looking to smear a school, just go find a special needs family. They're unhappy by definition, okay? And so it's just unfair. And so and that's the population that actually needs choice more than any other population of family. Is we need to have many more charter schools serving very particular special needs. Okay, so in New Jersey, for example, there's a charter school that is for autistic children. All right, and anyway, the point is that out of that story, she reported on the story of special needs families who were no longer at Impact School. They'd gone back to their local public school. So what is the complaint here? It was completely puffed up, created to, hit Impact schools unfairly. And then there was another piece on English language learners, and evidently Impact, where Ann Dornfeld claimed that the children learning English as a second language at Impact schools, there are a lot of them there because there are a lot of immigrant children. I think the percentages of low income and minority children are 62% at the Impact schools. And their English language, so Ann Dornfeld attacked them on their English language learning program. Well, it turns out that the way Impact treats the problem of children that these are 5 to 6, 7-year-olds, right? These are very young children. Contrary to what the traditional public schools does, the traditional public schools excludes them from the
the general education classes for the children who are not immigrants. Okay, the traditional public schools puts them in a separate classroom, and basically those children can't ever catch up because they're kept with other children that don't speak English. The impact public school model is to integrate and to include and put them with all the local children so that children can learn from each other. It's a very successful program, and their numbers, the data show that I think it's second in the state for English language learners. So this is the data that Ann Dornfeld kept out of her piece, the huge success that Impact Public Schools has had with English language learners. And she also kept out the success that they've had in math and in reading, and how that school system is ranked first in the state in math among schools with majority minority children, and third in the state among in English among that same sector of schools. So this is a high performing school system. You can tell just from the numbers. If you compare the number of children that are going to Puget Sound Elementary at Impact School, is 602 students there. And the neighboring traditional schools that are not performing as well have 300 to 400 students. So, you know, the market's working there to some degree, but there are not enough public charter schools available to meet everyone's demands. And
it's also interesting, we forget that just like, you know, we have competition in all kinds of services, and that competition, sometimes people leave that service and they're upset, they leave. And there's a learning opportunity there for the service itself. Like if you're a special needs family at the school and you leave the school, you know, if that becomes a trend, then the school suffers, and they have to figure out what are they doing wrong with that program. How are they failing? So those are opportunities, not necessarily, you know, simply identified as failures, because they have to attract people to succeed, right? And they have people are only there if they choose to be there, versus, you know, a monopoly system where if you're assigned by zip code, you're there and that's it. You know, if people are upset about it.
You know, if you're a special needs family, that's another interesting fact that came out recently, is that special needs families often are denied the services they're entitled to get by their districts, and they try to fight them. And if you have money, you hire a lawyer, and many of these families with lawyers actually win. And it turns out that that there are about 80 students that are very severely handicapped children that are whose families have hired lawyers, and because they needed to be put in person, you know, in residential settings to meet their particular very severe needs. And the state has no such facilities. These children have to be sent to far off places in Utah and South Carolina and Massachusetts, which is such a failure on its face. Washington State has no residential facilities for highly, you know, involved kids with special needs. And that's another indicator that we are not meeting the needs of families, and the monopoly system fails, especially the people that most need choices. They're not getting them.
Well, it's interesting, you know, it would be great if our broader media would focus on a series of, you know, where our schools are failing to serve, and what the opportunities are out there. I mean, because there's just so many opportunities for change, and we cater to individual need in all aspects of life now, in so many different ways. And yet, you know, there's this kind of resistance to that change, even though I think COVID kind of exposed it all, saying, you know, look, kids have individual needs, parents have individual needs. The current system serves the system well, but not the parents well, because you saw that resistance. So, you know, we're in a unique
look at what we did. I think that's such a good point. You know, look at all the efforts we made during COVID to the government funded efforts to help businesses not go out of business. Think about that. There were government funds provided so that the unemployed people weren't hurt. There were all kinds of efforts to protect businesses and people from the shutting down our economy, but no money was given directly to parents when they shut down the schools. I mean, if you're really trying to help the children, you would have released the money from the monopoly system and to put it in the hands of parents, so they had the resources they needed to educate their children when the government had decided to close their schools down. You don't see that happening.
Yeah, they could have had small group tutors, things like that, that might
Yes,
have been able to provide for kids and
yes.
other tools. It is frustrating. I don't want to run out of time. I did want to ask you very briefly before we get to the Q&A about there was a story I saw you commenting about
Mhm.
how some of the COVID relief funds were being used by school districts for critical race theory elements and implementing critical race theory in the schools. Describe how that's happening, and is it in Washington State? Is it a nationwide problem? How do you see it?
Well, it's a nationwide problem, but in our state, I reported on it a long time ago. I think it was right in the early parts of COVID. I noticed that the state superintendent of public instruction, Chris Reichdahl, had posted on his website the priority for the use of the $2.8 billion in COVID relief funds we got from the federal government. We got it in 3 tranches, 1, 2, and 3. And he put on his website, and I have it on our website, the priorities that he described for the use of these funds. And the top priority was equity and anti-racism training and all this social justice nonsense that is lowering the academic learning standards of our schools. I heard the other day that that the Tacoma School District is now giving extra points to children that are Black and Hispanic to bring their grades up. Okay, that is an effect of the critical race theory indoctrination that is now in the schools, and so I know that a lot of that the first spending of that COVID relief money was not to make up COVID learning loss, not to help the children get the tutoring help that they needed when they had their schools closed down. No, that was not the first priority. The first priority was to hire these diversity, equity, and inclusion consultants in every district to force these damaging and harmful and divisive ideas upon our schools. And if you start seeing your local school district do something wacky or crazy, it makes no sense, it's coming from that. It's just coming from this new philosophy that has been forced upon the schools. And it's happening across the country.
Yeah, I just find it fascinating how, you have this emergency that lasts, well, state of Washington's still under a state of emergency, but you have, and by the way, I'm still recovering from COVID from a couple of weeks ago. So I take it seriously. It's it hit me pretty hard, but this, you have what's supposed to be emergency relief money. And what was the relief for? The relief was for the learning loss that you've described in many different ways. And it's so obvious because kids were out of school for so long. So it seems like everything should be aimed at making up at least a portion of that learning loss, and starting with the most vulnerable kids and expanding from there. But instead it's an ideological grab bag opportunity where
it's terrible.
Here you have this slush fund, and instead of being used for the purpose, which is to deal with the emergency, it's being used for ideological implementation. And that's
it's a disgrace, really. I mean, let's not forget that parents are reacting to this. Okay, 41,000 families have pulled their kids out of the public schools in Washington State. It's one of the highest percentage of public school withdrawal in the country, and that's because parents with means or with time are deciding to homeschool or put their kids in private schools because they see that the focus is not on academics anymore. There's all this time being, spent on teaching children that they're oppressors or victims, and this is very damaging. We need to get rid of it. I don't know how we're going to do it. We have to get rid of it. It's using our children as pawns in this political game. It's threatening our First Amendment and our civil rights across the board. Teachers are not allowed to speak out if they don't agree with this. They're forced to hide things from parents about gender changes that children want to have. I mean, this is very bad. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. I've never thought that well, anyway, we need to fight this.
Well, you brought up a stat that's also part of a question that's been brought up by Matthew. He says, we heard that there are 50,000 plus students being pulled out of public school in Washington. Are there accurate statistics about what education options the parents of these students opted out for, homeschooling or private? Also, I heard despite the immense decrease in enrollment, schools were requesting the same amount of funding because they were so unprepared for it. Are there any updates on that?
Yes, I can tell you that because I followed that very closely. The numbers that withdrew were 41,000 families. I don't have the numbers of breakdown of how many of those families are going to private versus homeschooling, but I have read that homeschooling numbers have tripled in number. And I have read that that private schools are oversubscribed. There are long waiting lists in many of our private schools now. And as for the funding, what happened was the schools had this happen last year. They were fully aware this was happening. They went down to Olympia and got their funding. They backfilled for the students that left last year and provided them full funding. I called it funding empty seats. They got that money. Okay, so that happened last year. And then they claimed they didn't know this was happening. They came to the legislature again and demanded funding for the 41,000 students that they lost. And they wanted $650 million to keep their, budgets nice and swollen and despite having fewer students. And the end result was there was an outcry about it this time, and they cut it down to $340 million instead of $650 million. So they got half the money that they wanted, and I'm not seeing claims of needing to cut staff. So that's very interesting. They have so much money now. They have $18,000, and I forget, they have $18,175 per student statewide on average. So this means Seattle has about $22,000 per student. They have so much money, they don't know what to do with it, and they're spending that plus they have that federal money.
So they're only funding half the empty seats they were the year prior. That's
right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Next question, do charter schools get funding on a per pupil basis? If yes, isn't the accountability a loss of funds if parents don't like the school/outcomes?
That's an excellent question. And of course, that is absolutely true. The charter schools are much more accountable because they must attract the satisfaction of parents to get funding from the state. Yes, they are funded per student, and they must please their customers in order to get their funding. And so that is the latest attack from Ann Dornfeld, that they're not accountable. Well, that is to the public, which is a falsehood, because she leaves all that key element of accountability, which is parent satisfaction, out of all her pieces. Okay, so we should actually move to a school system that allows the parent to control the funding and let the parents decide where the funding goes. And if we had such a thing, it would be like, having your own money to decide whether to shop at Safeway or Thriftway. There would be all of a sudden competition for funds. There would be an improvement in quality, and the monopoly system would have to reform itself from within in order to attract its funding. And that's why the charter schools model is so exciting, because most of the charter schools have wait lists. You realize we've got only 16 operating charter schools right now, 4,000 students, 2 more to open in the future. And most of them have wait lists. They're not meeting the needs, the demand of the public.
Next question from Carolyn. Liv, how do you see Biden's LGBTQ agenda tied to federal food dollars to the schools working out here in Washington?
Well, I understand that they are, from reading about Florida, that the federal funding of lunch dollars is being tied to accepting this LGBTQ CRT, race and gender philosophy. So it's definitely what you're asking me, a question of something that is actually happening. And the governor of Florida has responded to this by saying they've gone off their rockers, which I think is a great way to put it. They've gone off their rockers. How can you justify holding up school lunch money to force a state to adopt a theology? And it's a theology. It's not just an ideology. It's actually a theology that you must not question. The CRT, the gender stuff, it's rigid. It is, it's really a dangerous trend. That's what I know about the Biden lunch and CRT and gender stuff. It's crazy.
Two comments from Kurt. He says, we've got a dangerous situation with no high-paying tradespeople. This is a disaster of our failing public education system. I think that's in response to you mentioning, 97% of these charter school students are graduating and go on to 2 or 4 year degrees in college. And, you leave out the need for high-paying trades and the overabundance of, people in college debt paying too much for degrees that aren't going to get them the right job.
Right.
And then he also laments that a lot of young people are moving to the non-woke states. His native Washington kids have moved to Wyoming, mainly due to a feeling of non-responsiveness and almost a bullying, ideological bullying in the schools.
I know, I'm worried about that too. We lose some of our best young people because they feel hostility towards them. Well, I don't know. I'm hoping that this whole experience with COVID and the fact that parents have no longer take the public schools for granted. They recognize that the public school system has not served them well during COVID. That is awakening up parents to the real situation that we have in our public schools, and that will lead to change. And because this is the first time I've ever seen so many groups involved in Washington State, parent groups. There's so many of them on Facebook, you wouldn't believe. Everyone's up in arms. They're demanding change. So this is going to have an impact, and a positive one. And we say to all those groups that don't just go for transparency of curriculum. Don't go for just fixing the deck chairs on that Titanic. All right. This is what I'm concerned that the goals that the goals are not bold enough. We need to move to a system where parents control the dollars. That's the monopoly will play games with whatever we do that is short of that. So that's my one warning. We must go for school choice. There were 4 bills introduced in the legislature last session. There are lawmakers who want to do this, and parents that want it. And so I don't see this as a democracy. We should have it.
Well, Liv, thank you so much for making the time. As always, I appreciate it. We'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode of Washington Policy on the Go. We'll talk with our Senate directors, get you up to date during your lunch hour on this free event that we provide for you and we hope that you share the information. You go to our blog, washingtonpolicy.org. We have updated information on our blog almost every single day, sometimes multiple times a day. And it's the kind of information and perspective that is frequently missing in other sources of news. So I hope that you'll bookmark that, visit it every day, and get your friends to do the same thing, friends and family members, so that they're up to date as well and informed about our state. And if you're not a member of Washington Policy Center, please go to washingtonpolicy.org, become a member. It's easy. I think you can do it for as low as $35, and you can be a part of the solution advocating for market reforms in Washington State. Again, thank you for participating, Liv, and for Todd, who's left us. This video will be available on our YouTube channel if you see something or heard something that you want to share at a different time. And we hope that you'll join us again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.